Grab a brew, listen up, and get back to you. This is Things I Wish I'd Known podcast.
Hello and welcome to Things I Wish I'd Known with your host, Rachael, the podcast where we create positive change through conversation. And today I'm super excited to introduce you to another incredible person who's got an incredible story. Anaurada is neurodivergent, queer, Indian diasporic person who lives in Greater London. So we already have something in common. And they really like to create change with small business through ethical and accessible inclusive practices. And I think it's a really important conversation to have. As a white woman, I, try as hard as I can to educate myself about all these kinds of things. But it's quite difficult when we've got cognitive bias and all these things where we've never necessarily had to think about somebody else's experience in the world. One of the things I love about doing this podcast and talking to different people is that we can learn through these conversations. So I'm so happy that you're here with me today. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us.
Yeah, thank you. What a pleasure, too. I love you already.
One of the things that I really wanted to touch on, because it's pretty incredible. You had your first business at 11 years old.
Yeah, that's right. I was so silly as a kid. I think I've always had entrepreneurial kind of spirit in my mind. My parents both worked at IBM.
Yeah.
So they were computer programmers. They were immigrants to the U.S. And so that was there, but they'd always have these side gigs going on. So I would help with that. So at 11, I created my own greeting card company. And at the time I called it Anaurada Cards Incorporated, cards with the K, my last name. And yeah, I just sold them. It was silly, mostly just using the scrap paper. In these big companies, they have the print jobs that have the beginning sets of paper, to identify. So she'd bring those home and I'd use them for scratch paper for math or whatever. But I also started making designs out of them because they were pretty colors.
Oh, it's amazing. It's interesting the language that you use around that as well. You're like, oh, it was just a silly thing. In my head, I'm like, no, like hustle culture. You were there 11 years old. Let's get this done, I don't think there's anything silly about that. So tell us about your journey then. How did you go from this, 11-year-old child who's sounds like super creative, has got this real entrepreneurial spirit, into creating the Kawtha constellation?
Wow, what a long journey. I think like many people born in my generation, that we've had a lot of different jobs, worn a lot of different hats over the course of our lives. So initially, I was a school teacher. I was a researcher in labs. Actually, I was a researcher in labs first, and so that was a technician. I somehow ended up spending a lot of time looking at enzymes.
Right.
Got pigeonholed into that very easily, but I was doing a lot of that as an undergrad. And then as a grad student, and then I went into education. I think the idea of I used this one machine all the time, and I was in a room by myself with the cuvette and the spectrophotometer. I got really tired of being alone in a lab, so I went into teaching, and I really enjoyed that, pieces of that. And I think in a way, it set me up, because I learned the skills of being around a lot of different students with a lot of different needs. I was in a low income area with high need. The students had a lot of different needs, diverse needs. So it really was a good learning environment. And I really wanted to make them feel like they weren't, because they were kind of put aside, put down, called stupid, like all these things that were really demoralizing to them, not given a lot of access into things, not being taken care of. So that was a big part of my journey and how I showed up in the world. I had already lived with people in our household with disabilities. I have my own neurodivergence and so on. So I'm used to it, but then getting to put it into practice and seeing the kids who were falling through the cracks, actually giving them a little bit of support, a little bit of attention, and they started thriving, really caring about science for the first time in their lives. So that was that piece. And then I actually went into grad school And that's what brought me here. I came here to do my PhD in dance to continue my master's work, where I was looking at how in colonialism in India, through the British colonialism, how did that change identity? How did that shape who we are, how we show up in the world through dance?
Oh, I love that.
So I came here to do my PhD. It didn't really work out for a number of reasons, and that's when I started my business.
It's super interesting, that topic as well, of, you know, looking at colonialism through the, I guess, veil of dance.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more? Like, I just from a personal perspective, people won't know this necessarily. I don't think I've ever shared this on the podcast before. I was a dancer for many years, like when I was a kid, yeah. And I think I started when I was like 3 or 4, and I used to do contemporary dance. And I danced until I was maybe like, I don't know, 16 or 17. I think I found like boys and smoking, and it suddenly wasn't as suddenly wasn't quite as but I loved to dance, and I still do. You know, I dance in different ways, but I still love to dance, and I think it's such an incredible way of being able to express something without language and without words, which can within that like transcend so many, you know, different cultures, because you're just watching the movement. And I always find it interesting how different people will interpret because obviously when you're choreographing, you'll think about what you're trying to convey, but then it's always interesting to see what other people think, you know, when they've overlaid. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Like you, I started dance very young. I was 4. And it's Bharatanatyam. So it's a temple dance style from South India.
Mm-hmm.
So unlike modern dance, there is often like a set way of choreographing and a set interpretation.
Yeah.
Like there might be, you know, if you're talking about, they're often spiritual based. So we are having conversations with God, or talking about, hey, Shringara is the rasa, the feeling that we're really trying to convey in Bharatanatyam.
Yeah.
So it might be Shringara, like love mixed with jealousy, or love mixed with devotion, or love mixed with, so different feelings. And so the point would be, you're speaking to God as if they were a little child, and you're showing that motherly love through that piece. So you have different types of flavors in dance. And actually, the spiritual piece is that as me emoting certain things and doing these relatively mundane actions in my dance, meaning miming, you know, that my love of a child, like swinging them to sleep, or that sort of thing, that kind of devotion that I would put in there, that then has an impact on the audience, and they see this, and then hopefully they can feel that same feeling, the rasa, the flavor that I'm trying to convey. And then through that, they get this elevation to, that's kind of what our scriptures talk about, that then they get this higher feeling that they can be united with God or divine or something like that. They can have that oneness with spirit that we want. So in this way, it's a performance. So in Indian arts, in Indian dance arts, Hindu arts, I should say, there is a combination. Dance and drama go together. They're not separated. So there's the element of both of these in our pieces, and then this spiritual overlay that hopefully we can also incite these things. And I think that is very similar to even the way Shakespeare, other, you know, famous composers or dance people, that's what we're trying to do in some way.
Like convey a message through. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting what you touched on there around like the energy as well. In that, you know, what I heard in that is that kind of what I'm feeling and how I can connect with the audience, and hopefully they connect with that same feeling. And that's that kind of energetic piece, isn't it? That unspoken kind of connection that you have. So how did, I mean, through your research, it must have been super interesting to see, like, how did colonialism affect that? Was it a bit, I don't know if you can summarize that for a podcast.
Mechanisms that colonialism impacted the world, or even this dance world.
Yeah.
Looking at a very specific subset, even then in Telugu speaking India, because my family is Telugu speaking. So I was looking at a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
So it's very, very minute, very niche. So obviously it did impact it. And I would say the biggest changes are it went from a temple art, and that's also partly the British. It's also partly due to colonialism through other forces in India, like the Mughal Empire and so on. So there's a richness, there's a tapestry.
Yeah.
That it went from a state, like it went from a temple art to a court, like a royal court art, to a stage art in a few hundred years. That evolution happened, and the last bit happened during British colonialism.
Interesting.
So how we performed the oftentimes the lower class people were kind of written out as it became elevated and it was attached to Indian nationalism, which I don't think is a fair thing to say completely, but there's earmarks of that as part of the independence movement. There's a just like, and this is what I would say because I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
That what happens in the story of colonialism, there's one right answer. So I kind of call it the billboard effect. There's one answer. This is how beauty looks. This is how we talk. This is how, right, Queen's English or whatever, these kinds of things. And then all the other people's stories get pushed to the narrative. But if you look at different lineages of dancers and we start centering them, dance is so vast. The stories, the lineages, my own teachers have their own stories, even though they might have had the same teachers. Two of my teachers studied with teachers who went to Kalakshetra. So it's a famous school, dance school. So, but even their experiences with that, one was a Finnish white woman, and one is his lineage is he's a Kuchipudi dancer in India, and so the male is the dancer in that lineage. The first male was the son who was supposed to pick up that art.
Right.
So two different people with two very different stories and connections to their art, and they're both incredible dancers.
Yeah.
So their story, the lineage of their different teachers, how they know them and see them. So actually, it's amazing that we've had this thousands of years tradition that we can still have this embodiment even today.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating as well, because through my kind of work that I've done on myself, but also working with my clients through trauma, I think movement is so important when we're looking at like resetting the nervous system, when we're looking at people being able to have like freedom from emotion. I think emotion can often get really stuck in the body. And I think in the West, especially, we tend to think that talking is the best way to process some of those emotions. And of course, talking has its place, I think, but I think embodiment and movement are so much more powerful a lot of the time. And sometimes people don't want to talk about it, and that's what I love about some of the tools that I use. It's like, if you've had a really traumatic experience that, you don't really want to relive, you don't really want to share, you can still process it without having to go into the details and things like that through movement, through things like EFT, one of the tools that I use. And I think embodiment is so important.
That's right. Because the trauma lives in our bodies.
Yeah.
So us connecting with that, I think, is in a way that's not triggering, right? That we're not reliving that same memory. Can we dance that piece out? Can we? Yeah. There was times when I was in rough spots in my life, and some of the dance themes, obviously some of the themes are, I would call patriarchal. I don't know if other Indian scholars would agree with my take on them, but they were often talking to a male god saying, hey, why don't you look at me? Why don't you pay attention to me? Right. That was a theme in several dances.
Yeah.
So, I don't love performing those kinds of pieces anymore, but they're part of the repertoire I have.
Yeah.
And I remember at that time there was a line in a dance, and it's in Telugu, so I won't try to say it for you all, but it was basically, am I such a burden to you, God? And at that time in my life, I was dealing with thoughts of being a burden
Yeah.
in the world. And my dance teacher who was with me, he was like, can you take that in? Can you dance those feelings now? And that's part of what saved me. That's part of what got me
Oh,
through that situation. And then I actually felt closer, not only to him because he understood me, as in my teacher, but also I understood the dance in another level.
oh, it's so powerful. So powerful. I think I definitely resonate with that. When I was suffering with depression for many years, I definitely had that feeling of I'm a burden on the world. People would be better off without me. What's the point? Why, why am I here? And I think sometimes thinking back now, some of the tools that people sort of told me to do at the time were like, get up and go outside for a walk. And I used to think, no offense, but like, oh, fuck off. It's like, I can't even get out of bed. You want me to go for a walk in nature? Like, gee, I don't think you really understand what's going on here. But actually, it's so true, because that movement and being out in a nice space full of nature is actually really helpful. But it's just difficult to hear at the time. And I think actually, if I'd have had maybe other movement practices, whether it have been dance or something different, I think it could have really helped. Like, I think being able to embody that feeling and just be with it, whether it's through dance or meditation or however you're going to process it, is just so powerful for being able to release it, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Dance and journaling certainly saved my life many times, in
Yes.
terms of just being able to be real and
Yeah.
be with be with this, not just myself, but also higher power or ancestors or other people, beings that maybe want that well wishes for us, but we're not connected to in that moment.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of having gone through that stuff and being able to embody those feelings and having, to kind of process that stuff, do you think that's helped you within your work today?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of people who do similar work, let's say DEI work in general, diversity, inclusion,
Yeah.
equity work in some way. And so because I've had training both as a scientist, as a writer, I was a professional writer and editor for a time. I was a teacher. I did dance. So there's the embodiment piece that brings a different flavor of how I can show up for my
Yeah.
clients, because I am going to be thinking very practical things that we can be doing.
Yeah.
And I really want to meet people where they are, not
Yeah.
force. So some people are like, just come tell me exactly how I can be more accessible. And that is against my mentality completely. We're
Yeah.
going to start where you are. Who are you as an organization? Who are you as the
Yes.
individuals that comprise this organization? And who are you together?
Yeah.
And from that, who needs to be accessible to you, right? And we don't all
Yeah.
have to be accessible in the same ways. We don't, right? But if we're not including people who are right there, then what's the point of doing more inclusion work to bring in more people that we can then harm? This is a backwards mentality, in my opinion. So we
Yeah.
really want to address who's there, where are we coming from, and what do we want as our organization?
Yeah. It
If
sounds
we
like a
keep,
culture piece.
yeah.
That kind of like, because I think there's a lot, like I go in and work with companies as well, doing, kind of consulting on mental health and teach meditation. And mainly I teach about kind of burnout and stress management when I go into corporate. But I often say to companies that I work with, similar thing, like, if your culture's effed up, there's no point me coming in and teaching everyone, like, on Stress Awareness Day and Mental Health Awareness Week, you're going to pull me out the dusty cupboard and I'm going to come and do a 1 hour talk and inspire everyone or teach them some tools that they can use. And then you're going to shove me back in the cupboard again and go back to overworking everyone, not giving people proper deadlines, not giving people proper support, not paying people properly, not allowing them to take their holiday, all these kind of things that I'm not, any companies that I do work with, and I'm not saying that you are doing this, but this is the things that you see constantly. It's like, no, you need to change from that inner piece so that, the work that then is being done actually filters through. Otherwise, it's just a tick box exercise, and it's not, and I imagine I haven't done much work in kind of ethical or accessible inclusion space, but I imagine there's a lot of people who are like, right, okay, how many Black people do we need then to make this inclusive? Or like,
what is this we can do? Like, oh, if I just use the hashtag Black Lives Matter or just use land back, then I'm covered, right? And it's like, but how can we really acknowledge land back and Indigenous sovereignty, even from your organization right now? We're making products, and our business is made by extracting labor from people unfairly, or extracting from the earth without giving a thought about it. That's where we need to be thinking. It is not just this, like you said, a tick box activity of putting your pronoun somewhere and and using or the right hashtag. Those are just rearranging deck chairs. If we really want to do deeper work, we really need to confront ourselves. Like if we're thinking about gender equity, then we need deconstructing that gender binary internally that we've, because of colonialism, right? That's where that came from.
Yeah.
There was a lot of gender diversity in a lot of cultures.
Especially in India, right? Because they used to have 5 genders before colonialism, I believe. I'm sure I've read that
as well, but I think there was I've heard different people quote even up to 16 genders. So I'm not quite sure. I've not read our scriptures about those kinds of pieces. So I can't speak for all of India, but there was a lot more inclusivity and understanding. And like in many cultures, I recently interviewed someone who is a Black trans woman in Venezuela. And she was talking about there was a spiritual element to being a trans person. And another Indian diasporic person who's trans also said the same thing. So I think there was a cultural element of these people can help us in a spiritual way as well. But that kind of all became subsumed by the colonial. This is what masculinity is. This is what femininity is, and how we constructed this gender binary. So if you're interested in being more gender inclusive, the place to start is really by looking at our own ideas of how gender shows up in a social way, in a practical way,
I think it's so difficult as well, isn't it? Because when you've got unconscious bias, the whole kind of part of the point is in the title, right? It's unconscious. And so being able to start to shine lights on that part of your own psyche, and I've done quite a lot of work on this on myself. I think anybody that's doing self-development work anyway will start to notice things about themselves that they think, oh, that's weird, I didn't know that about myself. But when you start, you've got to really be down for the work, haven't you? And I think this is what's quite tricky. A lot of people will just say things like, but I'm not racist, or I don't care if people are trans, or whatever, like, do your thing. I don't care if people are gay, just whatever, doesn't bother me. And that's great, but it doesn't actually overcome necessarily the unconscious bias and all the stuff that's been programmed into us just through living. Like if you think about, I grew up through the kind of like 80s and 90s was my childhood. And you think the amount of imagery that I was shown through those formative years of what's acceptable in terms of female body shape, what's acceptable in terms of beauty, what's acceptable in terms of relationships and how that works, and the kinds of things that you should maybe, personally I'm straight, and so I think there's a lot of messed up narrative around male female relationships, and how you just kind of, oh, it's not his fault, he can't control his emotions, or men don't have feelings, like these kinds of narratives that we've got to unpick, and then looking at everything else that doesn't affect you as well. Where can people start? Because if it's all unconscious and we have these biases and they're implemented through our culture, through where we've grown up, through our family narratives, through all these different things, if people are listening and they're thinking, shit, where do I start if I want to look within myself? Because I think that's really where this work begins, isn't it, for everybody? Right. How do they get going? What kinds of things do we need to be asking ourselves? Where do we start?
That is an excellent question. Do you have a few weeks? I'm just kidding.
Again, I like to ask you, a really difficult question, then be like, if you can give me that answer in a kind of like really neat 5-minute answer.
This is what you do. but honestly, my life's work has been around looking at how capitalism and colonialism have been indoctrinated into us through our schooling, through media, through all of these other things. So the thing to what I would suggest, and it depends on where you are in your journey, but as a general piece of guidance that I would give to a lot of people, is start questioning the biases that you're being presented day in and day out. There's a billboard with that message. What are ways, when I used to teach English, we would learn to read against the grain. So yes, we read with the grain, because then that causes a little bit. So it's a yes person. Yes, yes, yes. I'm going to agree with every assumption and paradigm and everything like that. Every premise they're handing me, I'm just going to take it on board. When we start to read against the grain, we start to not just automatically say yes. We start to read against that. Hey, what's the bias of this person who's speaking here? Hey, can I fact check that? Is that, when we're seeing this barrage of transphobia in this country, in the UK, and people are just picking it up, people are just bathed in it. So you're actually not helping a trans person when you say, I don't care if you're trans and whatever, but you're not speaking up in any way to defend them. Because right now, the worldwide, but also here in the UK, it's fever pitch. So people are literally being killed or denied services or access. They're living on the margins of society. They can't get jobs. Their IDs don't match who they are. They don't get to be called how they want to be called. So just a zillion things. They might have job history as before their transition. So just when we start to unpick this, we can say, oh, was this narrative written by someone who was actually trans and living that experience, or is this someone who's not? We can start to question that when we start to think about, it's these little questioning acts. Why? How are they doing this? Am I going to fall for this?
Yeah. I think it's also like being able to have open conversations where I think there's a lot of fear. Like I definitely notice this within myself. Like I have some good friends of mine who are non-binary. I've got people that are, so I guess in my friendship group, I'm around people that who are different to me, right? In lots of different ways. And sometimes I think, I have to be really careful because somebody that I've known for a very long time, they've just changed their pronouns. And so for me to stop misgendering them, it's quite tricky because I've known them that way for a long time, but they're actually incredible about it. And, they know that I'm trying and I'm doing my best, and occasionally I'll slip and then I'll correct myself and it's all cool. But I know sometimes there's not much room. And I think this comes a little bit with cancel culture, right? There's not much room for people to learn, to make mistakes, to change their mind. And I think this is one of the things I've noticed with the internet. And I'm not saying, I don't actually know how I feel about this. But when people pull up a tweet or something from, 20 years ago and say, this person, and they make a big news story out of it. This person 20 years ago said this. If that person has actively within that time, you can see that that's not their opinion anymore. It hasn't changed. When the internet came out, way back when, we were all posting loads of crazy, stupid shit on there because we didn't realise that it was going to be what it is today. And now we're kind of, because the internet is this incredible resource full of information, it's almost like we're supposed to know all the right language, every single potential cause and all the nuances and ins and outs of it and all these things without making any mistakes. We have to back every single cause. And I think it can feel really overwhelming for people because obviously I would like to think anyway, a vast majority of people aren't out to harm. I think a vast majority of people are, if you look at human beings in general, our nature is to be loving, is to be connected, is to work together. But I think sometimes, how do we have more open conversation without creating that, I don't even know what the word is, for people on the audio version, I'm making this weird thing with my hands of I don't know, rubbing up against, like when I think, because it's such a heightened situation, like if you are living as a trans person, your experience in life, I imagine, is that you've been up against so much hatred, potentially danger, constant. So you're going to be hyper vigilant of any. And then if someone's just asking questions, you know, quite casually, and it's not really down to them, is it, to
So we
hold
don't
space for everyone to learn? It's like, it's so
Well,
tricky.
Yeah. And so the thing is, the true people who are getting canceled by and large are the people who are the most hurt. So let's think about that.
Yeah.
And also, we don't want to be burdening unless we have consent and we have space in that relationship.
Yes.
Burden to be asking that person. So let's not ask because let's be honest, this statistics out of the US, but I'm sure it's a very similar statistic in the US, here in the UK.
Yeah.
White people have maybe one person of color friend. So white people, so we're thinking about white culture, white people only talking to other white people. And then they're burdening this one person of color. Maybe it's a Black person or an Asian person or a Latinx or Indigenous person, you know. So we're coming there and we're asking this one person to do all of that labor for us. So that's maybe not the attitude we want to come. There's a lot of people who've created amazing resources for beginners. So if you have a little time and you're looking at pronouns, you brought that up earlier, that there are lots of people who've done excellent pieces, books, Medium articles, and so on, that you can start to do that. There are
Medium.
Go ahead, sorry.
I love Medium.
Yeah. So
you learn so much on that. It's incredible.
Yeah. And there's so many excellent things. And then we can give, you know, the claps or, you know, send them money through Buy Me a Coffee or whatever, tip them in some way for that. If we can, even just sharing it with other people, sharing it with our audiences, that makes a difference too. So think about that. We can't be experts on everything. That is not true. It's really, honestly, for us to dismantle this capitalistic hellscape we're in, it's honestly going to take all of us to do our bit.
Yes. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is actually taking the time to educate yourself. Journaling, I think, is also, like you shared earlier, an incredible tool. And especially when you're trying to work on your unconscious, you know, sometimes just journaling things out, questioning yourself internally can be so powerful to help you get clarity on where to do the work. And I think, you know, for me anyway, I think listening is just a really important part of the work as well. And actually listening, you know, actively listening to other people in the space who have that lived experience, rather than getting your information, like you say, maybe from, I don't know, what white news presenters on the BBC.
Yeah, that's right. That's the best way forward if we want something different. And, you know, the other thing is there's a lot of learning spaces set up for this. So that's the other thing. I personally teach a class called Sowing Post-Capitalist Seeds. And it's not a anti-racism or a gender 101 kind of environment, but we are talking about ways capitalism has impacted us through our body, through money, through, you know, these very practical things, through land and so on, how it's impacting us on a day-to-day basis in ways we didn't know. We talk about the history, and then there's space for this community to develop where people are dismantling similar things. And then there's it's not a safe space, it's a brave space, meaning there is room for fumbling. We might make mistakes in that space. That does typically happen at least once or twice in a year, in a section. But it doesn't, I don't think there needs to be shame associated with that. There doesn't need to be destruction of the person. There is a place for us to have a facilitating, a deeper thing, have connection with the people. So we have a process in place to make sure any harm made, people are responsible for their actions and behaviors. So we definitely have that covered, but those kinds of spaces, there's popping up all over, and in online communities, in real spaces. You can go learn, and then you can practice, not with your harm, in a harmful way practice. You get to practice with other people who are working on the same or similar issues.
And I think it's giving yourself permission to make mistakes, because I think so many people have some kind of story around not good enough in one way, shape or form. And so they try to do things perfectly. And it's like, in these spaces, you can't really do it perfectly because everybody is unique. And so the way that one person likes to be spoken to, or the pronouns that they use, or they might be happy to hold a bit of space to have a chat about race, for example, or ethnicity or what have you. And then somebody else might be like, no, I'm not holding space for you, and I don't want, and you did get that incorrect. And so there's kind of like this space, I think, just for like learning and realizing that in the same way that when we learn anything, like if you were learning to play piano, you're not going to get every single note right every single time you play. You're going to mess it up sometimes, get a chord wrong. And I think it's the same when you're learning anything. And it's like, if you've really been, your whole culture and the whole narrative has always been the very same, and it's, male female relationships, and the world looks like this, and then you've got to unpick all of that. It's quite a big piece of work for people to do, isn't it?
It does. And where we can start with that is stop with this. I need to get like this. People come to me as if I'm the teacher. And I'm the facilitator in those spaces, right? And asking consent, super important, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Like everyone has capacity or wants to do that work right then. But then they expect that I'm going to give them a gold star and A+. And I'm like, no, that's not really my attitude. We homeschool our child, and really part of that is undoing that narrative of getting that A, doing, like, so we go into a thing not with the I need to get a good grade, but we go into the thing of what did I want to get out of this experience?
Yeah.
And asking ourselves that. And then based on those criteria, did I do a good job? Was I honest? Whatever your criteria is, you can make your own rubric of how to show up. And that's very powerful, liberating to say, did I get what I was hoping for out of this experience? Did I really do my best? Not from the teacher's perspective, not from a grader's perspective, but from my own perspective. And these are the millions of little unpicks we must be doing and thinking, who are we putting authority to? Like, are we thinking this person is an authority? Are we mitigating our own internal authority? So these are the kinds of questions we can be playing with.
Oh, I love that. I think what I'm hearing in that you shared is almost like making the goal, if you like, to be growth and knowledge and learning, rather than it being like, oh, I did my anti-racist work today. Aren't I a good human? And then off you go, into your daily life.
Well, because goodness has been associated with whiteness. Through colonialism, through racism, through the structural racism that was created here and in other countries like South Africa and the US and so on. The construction of how whiteness has been created is based on white equals good. So when we can start to challenge that narrative, and white people aren't the only ones who need to do this work, right? So that we have colorism throughout, like Asian culture, it's a thing, right? Skin lightening products and so on. So how are changing features to look more is the European standard of beauty versus. So a lot of people, when I say whiteness, I don't necessarily want white people to become defensive with that. Whiteness is the, like, fish swimming in the water. There's not that we don't think anything bad of the fish for swimming in the water, and that's the paradigm they're living in. We've been saturated in a culture of whiteness and the ways that shows up. Goodness is one of those. Perfection, you talked about, paternalism, right? These are all structures that whiteness tells us how we should behave in society, using the Queen's English or King's English. Right? These are all, that's the mark of good English. Yet there might be other ways we can speak. Like my brother, my sibling and I created Telugu and English. We would often mash up the words together.
Yeah. I love that. I used to live in a big warehouse years ago, and there was a group of people that lived there that we sort of like nicknamed the Europeans because they were all Spanish, Italian, and a lot of the time when they would talk, it was really interesting. They would mix English and Spanish or whatever, and you'd be listening away, and then you just hear like, I don't know, one English word, you'd be like, oh. It's like, I love the way people, but again, I think this is what's so great is like when you can actually bring people together. And I feel very lucky that I've actually lived in relatively, I think for a white British person, I think I've lived in relatively mixed spaces. When I was a little kid, my mum used to childmind children, and there was all different children. So we had, Japanese kids, black kids, white kids, Indian kids, and my neighbours were Indian, and so I used to go and cook with Sharon all the time. Hello, Sharon, if you're listening. And so and I used to love it. And what was so funny about it was my brother and my sister and I, we would be like dying to go and get Sharon's food because her food was like exceptional, and it was so different to what my mum would cook. It's like all spices and garlic and all this like amazing stuff, and Sharon's kids would always be like, oh hey yo, have you got any of that Victoria sponge cake from my mum, because they just wanted plain, because it was so different for them. And I think actually when we can, I don't know, when you live in close proximity to different people, you learn by osmosis. You don't necessarily have to I don't know, you don't necessarily have to learn because you're just observing and being together. And I think it's a shame that actually what often happens, I think you sort of touched on it earlier, is white people have like one friend, and similarly, I think a lot of the time, and I imagine this is a very natural human trait, is we want to be around people who look like us, who sound like us, who have similar interests to what we do, regardless of what that is. And so we end up in these kind of like pockets where it's quite difficult to have that crossover and to learn by osmosis, because actually we're in these kind of, dare I say it, like echo chambers of stuff. So how can people break out of that? Because it's also a bit of a weird thing, isn't it? You don't want to be like, hey, do you want to be my friend because I don't have any brown friends? Or, hey, do you want to be my friend because I don't have any queer friends? And it's like, how do people start to, break out of those bubbles, regardless of whether it be, maybe they need more white friends or more straight friends or more, how do you kind of break out of those spaces so that you can learn more by osmosis? Or is that even possible? Or am I being...
I think the conversation can be very different. When I'm talking with my, Black, Indigenous friends of color that have very radical points of view and so on, I'm learning a lot. It's a very different type of sharing, and a different type of learning that can happen. But how do you do that without damaging and hurt, because we don't want to go back into this, like Gayatri Spivak talks about this of academia in her work, and she's a scholar from India, and she wrote this piece called The Subaltern Speak, and it's 20-page PDF. You probably can find it online. It was one of these life-changing articles for me. And one of the reasons I started to leave academia personally is her understanding was because the Western model of education and academia is based on the global South and extraction. So we are constantly extracting. So when we think about, hey, I want to be in these cool conversations, I don't want to do the work of being safe, but I want the knowledge. This is the extraction mindset. So what I would say is, how do you do it? Well, I can't say that, right? But certainly I've intentionally made to go learn in communities that I don't know as well, is curate my feed. So like on Twitter or social media, or reading books by very different types of people, going to book clubs, so these kinds of things, you can bring those words and so on into them. And then when they do ask, because you'll see that more marginalized communities are living more on the margins. We're thinking about gender equity, pay equity, that there is the pay gap, but then people who are queer or trans or non-binary people, they maybe get like they're living on $10,000 or less a year. This is a US statistic, but I don't think it's that dissimilar here. So when we're listening to that, you see their conversation obviously is around mutual aid and mutuality and community building.
Yes.
How can you be in aid of that? I see white fundraisers being fulfilled within hours or days. I see people of color's asks gone unanswered for months or years. And they are just trying to get access to things that would help them survive, not even thrive, not even asking for big things.
Yeah.
They're unable to do that. This is how we can, I think, using our privilege, in whatever sense we have it, we leverage their asks. Can we ask, bring it to our communities? Can we, I've seen people give, I'll give you a free coaching session if you give this much to this fundraiser. So what I'm saying is, don't go with the extraction mindset. Don't go with what can I get out of it. That is exactly you replicating colonial structures. Instead, come to this with they're giving in the currency they have. So there's multiple forms of capital. We only think of a money capital, but this intellectual or social capital, they might be bringing those things a lot. And then how can we use our capital and return to them, nourish them? Because if we're just extracting, then we're just doing it again. If we nourish those people and those communities.
I've never thought of it in that way, actually. That's really given me a bit of an aha, like penny drop thing, when you're just like, oh my God. And this is the thing, is that, there's so much reading to do. And I've read not so much around, I've read quite a lot around race. I think a lot of white people did, right? When the Black Lives Matter movement and that whole kind of new civil rights thing came through, it was like, oh, holy shit, this is a big wake-up call for me and I need to really educate myself. And I haven't actually done so much around gender, which I'm, even having this, I was like, oh, yeah, still work to do. But I think that's the thing, is around curiosity as well. I think actually if we can potentially come at it from a space of curiosity, like that for me, extraction mindset, I just suddenly was like, oh my God, okay, that's something that I need to look at. Rather than it being like, oh no, I did something wrong or whatever. It's like, shit, okay, another blind spot. Right, let's look at that. Let's shine some light on that. There's so many things I want to ask you. I feel like I'm just looking at time and I'm like, oh God, this always happens on this podcast. I'm always like, weighing up like time and chat. And it's like, if you could go back in time and have a chat with a younger you, what's one piece of advice you might give to them?
That is a good question. I knew you were going to ask this. I
It's a
wrote
big
the notes
question.
ahead of time and they all seem inadequate now. Of course. I would say just to keep that courage, because I didn't realize how much of my life, even as a youngster, was living in this courageous place. And we lived in a mostly white community and white schools and a white neighborhood. And then there was a lot of Indian community. So it was like very segregated in my life. Social things were often with Indians doing like we'd have performances or food or music things. And then this very white culture. And I didn't feel like I fit in properly in either, to be honest. And so many points along the way, we talked about depression earlier. And I think just that older person, me, or like an older sibling, what I would have liked to have been is like, you're on the right track. Keep going with this courage, one step in front of the other, and don't give up, even though it feels not good at moments. Keep going.
Yeah, for sure. I think that thing around not fitting in as well is so poignant. Like, it took me years to feel like I fitted in anywhere. And I definitely resonate with that. I know it's obviously in a completely, probably different way, but it's so painful when you feel like there's not really somewhere where you fit or that people understand you. And that, I know that I think this is potentially where my depression and stuff came from, was just from masking. And again, I think I'm waiting. if the NHS is listening, I've been on a wait list for 2 years. They've said it's going to be another 2 years, but I'm waiting to see about ADHD. And I think a lot of stuff maybe came from that, of being like, oh, I can't behave in this way, or I can't say this thing, or I can't move my body, I've got to stay still, I've got to, you know, and it kind of like creates this feeling of just like, I don't know, not belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Schools and most places aren't neurodivergent friendly at all. So it can, masking can look like depression or trauma, right? There's an overlap because they're all types of neurodiversity, to be honest. Depression impacts our brain, so we're not in the same way that a neurotypical person is going to think and behave.
Yeah, I read something recently actually that really surprised me about depression and how it affects your eyes, and that actually you literally see the world differently when you're depressed. It kind of takes some of the colour out or something like that. And I was like, what? No wonder, you know, when you think people talk about it making the world grey and people talk, I was like, shit, yeah, that's super interesting. It's so much to learn. Tell me a little bit as well, because I'd love to just touch on, for people listening, a little bit about the Kawtha constellation. Because why did you call it constellation rather than, I don't know, company or collect? I know that I sort of said collective earlier incorrectly, and so I'd love to know how that word came about, because I love that idea of constellation.
I think it's many factors. The biggest one probably is my name. Anaurada is one of the 27 nakshatra, so stars in Jyotik astrology. And so I wasn't born under that star, but that name, having that quality, certainly has impacted me. And you know, for a long time I didn't like my name. I think it's only later in life that I've embraced it. Like, okay, I actually like my name. I wouldn't actually change it. After years of perhaps thinking it's so hard, no one pronounces it right, whatever. So that was part of it. It was I've had 2 or 3 other names of my business before, but this time it felt really important to capture my last name. So I didn't change my name after getting married or anything. And we do, so that side of my family, some of them still live in India, some still live in that village or near where my grandfather lived, and so on and so on. So it was like a way of honoring ancestors and honoring that place and that land. And also this quality, for me, community is super important. And we're not always connected to every community in the same way. So like I might be in a constellation with this group here with the queer community and having friends and doing different things there. But then I might have this other community of people in the UK or people who I went to grad school with, right? So there's different facets of me and different facets of other people, what we're all working towards in these different constellations, different stars, different individuals coming together.
Yeah, I think as well, I don't want to get it wrong, but I think I read on your website that you said about kind of illuminating and liberating, you know, within companies as well. And I thought, I love that, like, thought of it's this kind of constellation. So there's maybe lots of different, you know, like how the stars in the sky in a constellation, they're still a separate star, but they're also part of something much bigger, in the way that, you know, to illuminate and shine light on all these kind of areas that really it's kind of shadow work, isn't it? You know, and it's like actually being able to bring some light into those spaces. So I just thought, it's a really beautiful, the way the language kind of illuminates the work as well. It's beautiful.
Thank you for not only asking but seeing the levels of symbolism, that because for me every single element in my company, even my logo, everything is not me, is not one person. There's often a community effort behind so many things. So thank you for seeing those levels in that.
Well, it's down to your obviously good copywriting and everything. when I'm doing my research, you've obviously like got that message across, you know, through the things that you've written and your social media and your website as well. What one thing do you wish you'd known about, and I'm sure there's way more than one thing, but it's the question for the podcast. What one thing do you wish you'd known about, the work that you do and ethical practices? I mean, it's going to be very hard to answer, I imagine, as one thing.
Yes, one thing. I guess I think so much of the programming I received was there's some part of me that doesn't belong, that I'm the one, like we talked about, being a burden or being the one who's messed up in the family. So much shame. And I'm really coming to grips with seeing that for what it was and not having to take that on. So I guess my takeaway from that is it's okay to be who you are, be where you are, and just acknowledge that, right? Let's not be pretending to be someone else. Yeah. Because we are where we are, and we can grow from where we are, but we can't deny that. And I think too much of my life I was denying aspects of who I was.
Oh, I love that answer. I really do, because I think that comes back to what you were saying earlier as well, around that kind of just questioning and just being able to, this is why I love the idea of curiosity around everything, because that way it sort of takes out the shame a little bit, and it takes out, it's just like, oh, okay, well, why do I do that thing, or why do I feel that way about that certain thing, or the way that you talk as well about that kind of inherent indoctrination into these kind of systems and into these spaces. And it's like actually just being able to question that and to come back to ourselves and not deny those parts. I think that's beautiful. So is there anything else you'd like to add, anything you want to share, anything you wish I'd asked you that I hadn't asked you?
Well, first, I want to say thank you so much for your time, because I have enjoyed this. This went in a very different direction than I had thought in my notes, and I've enjoyed this. Thank you for making it a safe space to talk about race and gender and so on, because there's a lot of people who in this country, in my opinion, we're behind even the U.S. conversation. So we are. Being able to have that space to look at it is amazing. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
And what do I wish you'd ask me? What are the ways we can, maybe how can we do this work when we do have chronic illness or mental health things, or like, how can we keep showing up to do this work when we have these other challenges, like when we're facing racism?
That's such a good question. Yeah, because I
think... How do you do it? I'd like to hear your answer first. How do you do it?
What? I do it in, if I'm honest, I do it in fits and starts a bit. And I think because, like, my mental health is pretty good now, most of the time. Like, it's rare that I have panic attacks anymore at all. It's rare that my depression gets to the point where I can't get out of bed or I can't function. But I do still have to really monitor myself quite consistently. And there's things that I have to do that probably other people don't do. And sometimes it will, I can't keep on top of certain things, like, I can't believe I'm admitting this on the podcast, but, keeping on top of things like just keeping my house tidy. I know that when my brain isn't functioning maybe as effectively as I know it can, my house will get really messy, or I don't want to wash up, or because I just physically don't have the capacity or the energy to do all of the things that I need to do. And so some of those things slip. And so I guess when I'm in those spaces, my priority is to get myself back to the optimum that I can be in any one time, because I try not to give myself narratives around good or bad, if that makes sense. So like, oh, when I'm not on top of this stuff, then I'm bad and there's something wrong. It's just like, okay, right now I don't have the capacity for all of these things, and the capacity will come back because it always does, but I just need to look after myself in a different way and be more compassionate and more loving towards myself. And I think when I'm in those kind of spaces, it's actually quite hard to hold space for anyone else other than my private clients and people that you know, and people will see. When I had long COVID recently, I've been suffering with long COVID, I haven't recorded the podcast, I haven't written my daily newsletter, I haven't done much social media at all because I just didn't have the capacity. And then when I feel good and strong, it's like, right, okay, great, let me get a new book, let me learn some stuff, let me journal out, let me look at, you know, what other shadows have I got? What other ways can I be supportive in communities that maybe I'm not aware of? What other ways can I look at? Because one of the things I like to research and I'm quite interested in is how, and actually even way before the Black Lives Matter thing blew up, I can't remember, it was June, was it? I remember it being summer and it was it 2019 maybe? Even way before that, when I was doing research into my business, I started looking at data around access to care, because my access to getting help was really slow and difficult. And then I started seeing, like, hang on a minute, the wait lists are so much bigger if you're not white. I think I wish I'd had the data to hand because I haven't looked at this correctly. I haven't looked at this for a while, so I might be incorrect, but it was something like you're 9 or 12 times more likely to get sectioned if you're a black man for the same symptoms than if you're white. And I was like,
That's
what?
right. That's true.
You
Maternal mortality, like
5 times more likely to 5 times. It's like, that's like boils my blood, you know, like genuinely. It's like childbirth anyway, you know, is a very difficult time. You're super vulnerable, you know, and then coming up against like medical racism and the fact that, you know, your pain might not be listened to in the same way. And it's stuff that, you know, personally, I've experienced with certain doctors where they've not listened to me around certain things. I think part of that is being female, but then I think to add on top of that race and other, you know, other things that may make it even more difficult, I'm like, holy crap. You know, if it was hard for me as a white woman, how much harder must it be for other people? So yeah, that's something that I really like to look into and support. There's an incredible charity, actually, I want to give a shout out to, called Black Minds Matter, who I've supported, and they do incredible work getting free courses of therapy with black therapists, because that's another big issue of like getting access to a therapist who maybe has a similar life experience or similar, you know, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation to you is quite tricky to do as well. So they're an incredible charity. So if people are listening and they want to support, I highly recommend looking up Black Minds Matter and supporting them. They're a great charity. So yeah, I don't know, I've gone off on one here, haven't I, a little bit? Going on around.
I love it. But I think that rawness, that realness speaks to that whole hustle culture that we had mentioned earlier, that whole, you know, the goodness, right? That, because there is a whole thing, even with the pandemic, it has not really shown people by and large that ableism exists in our society, and to the degree it shows up, and the intersectionality with other things like we talked about, medical racism. So that's that intersection of ableism and racism together, that people aren't having these conversations enough. People aren't kind of showing behind the scenes of, I had long COVID and this is what happened. A lot of my operations had to kind of come pare down to the absolute necessities. That's so good. I wish more people would be frank about those things instead of talking about their whatever launches and whatever stuff they're doing, and be honest, saying this is how that happened, or this is how it doesn't happen.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the things I've always tried to be as honest as I can. And when I say honest as I can, I think when you're really in those spaces, sometimes you're masking and you're not even realizing that you're masking.
Yeah, that's
sometimes true. If you're going through something, like when I was doing another layer of some trauma work, I don't want to talk about it because I'm in the work and it's painful. And, you know, maybe I might want to write about that at some point or talk about that at some point. But if I'm in it, I might not want to. And that's also okay. And I think sometimes when you've got like almost like a public space where you share about things like trauma, mental health, you know, there may be an expectation for you to be like fully in your truth and embodied in your truth at all
that's
times,
right.
and all that stuff. And sometimes my truth is I want to hide under a blanket, eat some ice cream, and I don't want to talk to anyone.
Absolutely. And why should we have to, because of capitalism, have to even monetize that? We have to monetize how bad we're feeling, and that I don't recommend anybody having to do that.
And sharing, I can't remember what she said. Brené Brown had a really beautiful quote on this, actually, around essentially she was sort of saying, you know, I'm probably going to butcher this. I don't know why. My listeners know that I do this a lot because I never know what the questions are going to be. The answers are not always very well researched. But she said something along the lines of, you know, vulnerability isn't necessarily, you know, crying on camera, for example. So you might see some people, I see this quite a lot on social media now, people, and this is no judgment. This is actually coming from a place of just, it's not something that I personally would feel comfortable doing, and maybe other people do feel comfortable doing it. So there's a disconnect in my understanding, right? Mm-hmm. But they might have a panic attack on camera, or they might cry on camera and say, oh my God, I'm so depressed and this is happening. And maybe that's part of their process, right? And maybe that's part of them sharing their truth, and that's cool. So I'm not saying people should or shouldn't do that. People should do whatever they feel called to do. But for me, it's like, if I'm having a panic attack, the last thing I'm thinking of is getting my phone out. And so it's...
Yes.
She was sort of sharing
That's
that basically... I can't remember the language she used, but basically that's not always vulnerability. That's almost like emotional dumping, rather than true vulnerability.
Or like performance. There's a performance element to it, possibly.
Potentially, but you know, when sometimes I think with that performance element, it's like if part of your because I see that on social media a lot anyway, regardless of whether it's to do with mental health, this kind of performance piece. But I think we're so trained to get our validation externally.
Yes,
that it's almost like you can't really blame people that when I have this kind of framework that I work within with clients and within the membership, and like two of the parts within that is like acceptance is one of the A's, validation and values. Mm-hmm. And I think often we're so like you say, indoctrinated into, especially as women, people that identify as women, you know, be beautiful. Don't say things that are going to be controversial. Be graceful. You know, the way that you dress has to be a certain thing depending how old you are. Yeah. You know, like these kind of things that we're just indoctrinated into, so that when we then try and go, where am I going to get my validation from? We're not necessarily automatically getting it from ourselves, because we haven't been taught to do that. We haven't been taught to say, I love you, I accept you just the way that you are, I think you're an incredible human being, and you have these great traits, like maybe you're super kind, or maybe you're very funny, or maybe you're loving, or maybe you're this. We're actually looking for someone else to tell us that. I want you to tell me that I'm beautiful. I want you to tell me that I'm accepted in these spaces. I want you to tell me that I'm kind, or that I'm... And so then you are going to perform in that way to try and get...
Yeah, exactly. And I don't mean performance necessarily in a negative way. Sometimes we're talking about masking. We are performing what other people think that we should be, right? There's just so much like care work that's associated with, you know, someone who's been, for me, socialized as a woman in Asian culture. Then I'm supposed to be doing care work and being, you know, a certain way all the time. And that, to me, so I can perform that. I can do it if necessary, but it's really tiring. And that's not really who I am. Not to say I'm not a nurturing person, but that's certainly...
People nurture in different ways as well. And this is the thing, isn't it? It's like there's such a standardized... You know, what I've found interesting, just kind of looking into your work, there's almost like this very standardized thing of like, to be, you know, and when you, even if you just look at archetypes, like to be a mother, to be a lover, to be this, to be, you know, there's so many, it's almost like this very narrow, I've always felt like this as a woman, there's this very narrow space that we're allowed to operate in. Mm-hmm. And actually, for most women that I know, we're not in that space. we might have to operate in it, but really, if we were able to be fully embodied, be fully, in our truth or whatever that means, we would, or fully authentic, we're not in that narrow little.
And most of us aren't, right? Most of us aren't fitting into that. So why not just kind of look at that whole framework that's been put on us and say, do I really need to take this on board? Do I really need to put this on people? And then even with myself, with coming back to chronic illness and so on, I try to make my life where I've set my business up where from low tide, can I still run it?
Oh, I love that.
A lot of the kind of practices I try, because a fair number of the people who work with me are chronically ill or neurodivergent, or they're not fitting in the world in the way that they're supposed to. So I'm like, how can we set things up in a way that you can be successful and it can be more sustainable?
Yes.
Right. And more authentic.
Yeah, definitely. I think I definitely could take a leaf out of your book there. I just love to do all the things and I get really overexcited about all the stuff. And then I'm like, how are you a one person? There is only so much hours in a day. There's not really, nobody could actually do what you've set out to do necessarily unless they had a team, and then I get tired and go, shit, okay, I'm going to have a little rest and then come back to it. So yeah, sustainability might be something I need to need to look at. And I like that idea of low tide rather than it being, I like that analogy. It's almost like it's very fluid. And again, like taking out, that's been a key thing I think for me, is taking out blame when I'm not able to operate in the ways that I know that I can, I know that I'm capable of, but it is like a tide, isn't it? Sometimes I'm able to operate and I'm like, great, my symptoms are really low and they don't really bother me. And other times it's like, oh, hello darkness, my old friend. What do you need now? Oh, it has been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for your time and for joining and sharing all these incredible tools and questions. I think it's going to be so helpful for people. I'll put links and everything obviously in the show notes, but if people want to find out more about your work, how can they get in touch? What's the best way for you?
Yeah, most places I'm either by my name, Anaurada Kawtha, or the Kawtha constellation. And if you're interested in that course, it is sowingpostcapitalistseeds.com.
Beautiful.
So,
and is it self-directed or is there specific times when it's running?
Yeah, it's specific times. So the next cohort will be next fall. So Brilliant. People can sign up already and get ready. And then there'll be some resources they'll get ahead of time, but then we'll join all at the same time next fall.
Perfect. That's so great. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, as always, to all the listeners for listening. It really is for you guys that I look for these interesting people to talk to and share these conversations. As always, if you are listening on or watching on YouTube, if you can subscribe to the channel, it's going to really help us get more listeners. If you are listening on your favourite podcast platform, please do leave us a little review and also click that follow button so that you get notified when all the new episodes are out. And again, it really, really does help us to reach more people. The more people we reach, the more interesting guests we can get, and so we grow together. Thank you so much for listening and being here. As always, I'll be back with another episode very soon. Much love.
We hope you've enjoyed listening as much as Rachael enjoys making this podcast. Why not share it with a friend in need of some heartwarming inspiration? And if you really love it, drop us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps us reach and inspire more people. Thanks for listening.